Good morning. This is a regular meeting of Eugene Planning Commission on February 13th. So we'll start. We always start with public comment, and we reserve 10 minutes at the beginning of the meeting. And you can comment on any matter except for items scheduled for public hearing and public hearing items for which the record is already closed. And it looks like is there anybody from the public that would like to come up and speak? No, okay. Then we'll go to agenda item number 2. So this is items from commission and staff. Commission, do you have any items that you'd like to bring up? No, okay. Items from staff.
Nothing great.
Nothing great?
Nothing in particular.
I only want to hear great things.
Nothing of great importance. I did just want to mention that I think I've heard from some of you, but not all of you, about the training. And I was going to send out today, this is the training on April 19th for the speed of trust. And if you haven't responded, let me know. You can let me know today if you want to. Otherwise, I'm going to send that out probably by the end of the day.
Perfect.
Just the project for public spaces is sent their draft report out and is going to be presenting that to council, I think, on Wednesday. So that's the downtown area and that type of thing. So if there's any interest in that, that's going on Wednesday.
On Wednesday. Okay, perfect.
Yes, thank you.
Are there any other items you want to?
Let's see. I was just also going to mention that there's a public hearing on the evening of the 15th, and I'm sure you're all aware of that, for the appeal on Oakley. Wait, no, sorry, wrong one. Public hearing on appeal of planning director's decision, the Oaks, at 14th.
Are there any commissioners that will not be in attendance? Okay, John Jaworski. Great, thanks. Okay, so we have one last item, and it goes back to the public. I don't know if anybody has any comments from the public. Just how are we doing? Okay. So we'll go to agenda item 3, and it's a continuation of 2 weeks ago, and it's the UGB adoption package. And lead staff, we have Terry Harding and Emily Jerome.
Thanks. So yes, this is part 2 of walking through the adoption package binder. I'm glad you all brought it with you and lugged it back to the meeting. And several of you have more sticky notes throughout, so that's good. What I thought we would do today is pick up where we left off, with one exception of going back and picking up the comprehensive plan, because there's more that we want to say about that. Then we'd pick up where we left off in the expansion studies, and I would invite Sarah back up to launch back in. And the bulk of our time today will be talking about residential. We haven't talked about that at all yet today, and that's what the bottom part of your binder refers to. And we have Beth Goodman here with us again. She and Heather will come up to talk about the residential land study. Does that sound like a good outline? All right. So the comprehensive plan is located in your binder at the B1 tab. And I want to call your attention to the second page of it, which is the table of contents, and just explain what's in here in this first draft. So the grayed out chapters are intended to be complete at a later date. So those include topics that are not required to be finished at the time of urban growth boundary adoption. So things like public involvement and compact development and urban design, these are things that Envision Eugene includes, but is not a part of this first phase of adoption. What is in this packet is City of Eugene specific policies on Chapter 3, Economic Development, Chapter 9, Transportation, Chapter 10, Administration and Implementation, and that's where the growth monitoring policies are located, and Chapter 11, the Eugene Urban Growth Boundary. and also the introduction, and that's important because I want to spend a couple minutes on the introduction. It's on the next page, and it talks about kind of where this plan came from, how to use it, and then on the second page, more specific information about what goals and policies mean and what legal effect they have. So this is something that many of you are familiar with because you've participated in helping develop this plan. But for members of the public and for folks who use plans from around the city, this is a really important chapter that sets the stage for how to use the comprehensive plan. So in particular, there's a section that explains what policies are. And the policies are adopted by the council to guide future decision-making for land use related items. The policies, there's a statement halfway down the paragraph that says these policies will not be used in determining whether the city shall approve or deny land use applications, unless such direction is specifically stated in the policy. And that statement was added in here after some public comment asking about this very issue. So the question was raised, in the past, Metro Plan policies have been really unclear whether they are triggered by a land use application review or not. So the intent with this document is to make it very clear the ones that are drafted in this version are not intended to apply at the time of land use application review, but this statement leaves room for future policies to be developed with that intent in mind. Does that make sense?
So there's none going forward that are triggered?
Correct.
Okay.
And there are also none that would be undone. So existing refinement plan policies are unaffected, they're still in place, and existing Metro Plan policies that are not to be amended in here will also stay in place. Okay. Well, I think that's what I wanted to say about the introduction. And the rest of the policies, I think, they all support the goal of implementing our new urban growth boundary. So most of the economic development policies relate to that. They relate to requirements in the Oregon administrative rules for adding land for your economic development land supply. So there are some references in there when they are required by the state. And for each policy chapter, I would also say the structure is intended to be simple and at the appropriate level of goal and policy for a comprehensive plan. So each of the chapters is organized around 3 goals that are pretty broad and memorable, hopefully, by limiting them to 3, that express the city's kind of broad goal intent with regard to the topic. Then as you go through the chapter, you'll see a variety of different sections that respond to different parts of the law or bring forward priorities in the regional economic development plan, and things like that. There are a fair amount of policies that relate to the land supply itself on page ED-3, land supply. Yeah. That's what those are about.
So I had a question on that.
Question on those?
Yeah, just since you were saying that policy and then doesn't apply to a land use thing, and you said there weren't any in there, but 3.17 is the policy about protecting the large lots, and that would be applied into the new code, into the Clear Lake overlay zone, right? So,
right, but the policy itself doesn't do that. We've written it into the Clear Lake overlay zone, and then this policy provides the kind of policy
why you're doing it.
guidance or value that was then translated into the code.
Okay.
Right. Good question. Leaving economic development, the next chapter is about transportation. I think we already covered this at the last meeting, but to bring us up to speed, this chapter would refer to the future 2035 TSP, the Transportation System Plan, but we won't know exactly how to characterize that until that plan is adopted. So this is a bit of a placeholder until that happens. Okay. Then the chapter on administration and implementation again, has the 3-goal structure and policies under different topics. We had a medium-sized discussion last time about the monitoring policies and kind of how it functions the same way as the economic development policy. So these policies set the policy support for the program, the monitoring program. They enable it to happen, but they aren't what actually controls the ongoing day-to-day operations of the program. That'll be done in a more nimble fashion through the committee that's established and the program details that are in a separate document. Eventually, they'll be located in the action plan. If you recall, our 4-part plan that goes from vision to action. The comprehensive plan is the second piece of that overall 4-piece set, and the action plan is the last one, which contains a lot of the implementation items. Policies are here in the comprehensive plan.
So can you explain where that action plan in the timeline, or how that gets implemented? Is that an administrative order from the city manager? Can you just go through that so that?
Not
And
necessarily.
where the input from this body would be on that?
Sure, you can have ongoing discussions about that. It's an implementation program that the city would carry out with its committees over time. So in terms of the UGB adoption, policies enabling that program need to get adopted here. And then we implement that with, as a work plan item through our ongoing work. Does that make sense? The action plan itself includes more than the monitoring program, and that's the next step after adoption of the UGB would be to bring the action plan forward to the Planning Commission.
But I might just point out, to be clear, these are written as directives to the city, that even if, a monitoring program is prepared and ready as a next step, so that will be happening. These are directives. If for some reason that monitoring program wasn't in place, these would operate to impose monitoring requirements on the city. These are just sort of the absolute high level, what has to be included, and there'll be a lot more, but if you read, for example, 1010. City manager shall report to the city council and the community on relevant growth monitoring program data as follows. And, 3 bullets. So
Right.
that has to happen.
Right.
The monitoring program is going to provide some more detail about what that report includes and what's, but these are directives that would stand alone, but what part of what they require is a growth monitoring program and what data is collected and that sort of thing.
So if we wanted to give direction to make the monitoring program a little bit more robust or more prescriptive, would we put it into this section here, or would we wait for the action plan to give that input?
Well, it was a fine balance. There was a ton of work done on the monitoring program, as you probably know. And as the lawyer, when I came in, there are certain elements of it. This is hard to amend. Here we are. Amending the comprehensive plan involves a lot of process and consideration. And with a new monitoring program, you want to be careful not to impose requirements that you're not quite sure of yet or that you want to try out. So I would say if there are things that you absolutely know need to be part of the monitoring program beyond what's in here for a long time, this is the place. But if you have different kinds of data that you want to try collecting and maybe that doesn't work and you need to tweak it because after the first report it wasn't as informative as you hoped, it's a lot like the budgeting process when you're asking for particular information. That's better put in the program itself, which will be able to change what's in the program in an easier way. And I don't know if we've just determined how that's going to get approved or adopted yet. But then sort of I would say, it's kind of skeleton of the program, the directives of the program that live here.
So the policies are really kind of that framework, the high-level framework that allows all this stuff to get filled in.
Yeah, and requires it.
And it requires it.
But yeah, the meat on the bones
Yeah.
comes in that other
Comes in
document.
the next page.
Emily, Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I was just following up. I know Commissioner Borofsky originally mentioned this, but, so for example, if you wanted to add a bullet that these 3-year monitoring programs, shall be used to modify the targets or something, wording. I mean, it's not very specific how it would be done, but that would be a directive that would be, it seems like that would fit here, and the details would, what that meant would be dealt with in action plan, but at least it would be specified that you're supposed to do something with the growth monitoring program data.
Right. I mean, this is here in front of you because if you do have that level of amendment you want to make, that's a recommendation we could make to council on your behalf.
I should have mentioned something at the front of the meeting too. And I think Kristen said this last time, but it's really helpful for us, and I think we'll all do better in the process after the public hearing, if everybody can keep track of their questions and comments that are like that in some place to allow us to deliberate on them as a full
Sure.
after the public hearing. So I appreciate the questions coming up. It helps us know what your questions are and all of that. But we're gonna have a public hearing and hear a lot of input. So it'd be helpful if folks tracked their substantive comments, and I'm sure you are, but just a reminder to help with our deliberations.
Well, no, I mean, what I was, it was brought up that there's a second phase to this, and that's the first time I've heard that about, the action plan. And so I was wondering, I was just asking,
Yeah.
should the implementation things that I have concerns about be addressed in an action plan, or do I need to worry about getting them in the comp plan? And that's what I'm trying to figure out at this
Got it.
point.
Okay.
Did you get your question answered?
Yeah, I mean, for me, if it seems to me like there should be some sort of triggers, if data is off such and such an amount, maybe that triggers. Now, I don't know if that needs to go in here or not, and that's what we'll discuss when we're in deliberations. But I hadn't heard about the action plan, and I didn't know how we would be what our implementation and councils would be on the action plan, whether it's a administrative order that's being written by the city manager. If that's the case, then I think that the input would need to be up front so that we can help direct the city manager. But if it's something that's done as a planning commission and city council, then that could perhaps wait.
Okay. Okay, so after that chapter, there is a slim chapter called Eugene Urban Growth Boundary in the comprehensive plan, and this is where the map is actually located. It's on the second page, and it's a small scale, but I think we had some discussion about this last time also. We will have a bigger scale map in the final product, and also the official version will live in a digital format. So that'll be available for people to use. There's a glossary, and that's really what's included right now in the comprehensive plan. There's a couple of big appendices to it. UG Beyond the Disc and the Employment Land Study, which we went through last time, and the Metro Plan amendments, right? Yeah, Metro Plan amendments, which we also went through last time. Any other questions about the structure or the comprehensive plan before we dive back into expansion analysis?
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, just a quick question. So on this section, you just talked about the map. There'll be a larger map, and there will be some digital data, like a GIS file that will more exactly locate it than, say, a blob map, right?
Right.
That's all I'm going to confirm.
Okay.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I raised my hand right as you turned around.
Okay.
For the Envision Eugene pillars, those specifically are designated as policies or goals?
They are, at this point, not adopted policy.
Okay.
They were approved by the council as kind of a guiding framework or community values for the project. But they are listed in the comprehensive plan. In the introduction,
I3?
I3, so they're listed and described in the comprehensive plan. This wouldn't adopt them as policies either, however. They're more of a contextual framework for the whole
We've
project.
seen people use them in land use applications before, so that guide as part of their written statement. So part of that clarity may be helpful.
Yeah,
Just trying to help.
that's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, not to make this more confusing, but, but when I go back on 1012, which was ANI 4, I guess, it says the growth mounting evaluation will be, and it goes and it states, and achieve key program objectives, and then it lists what the key program objectives are. I thought the growth monitoring program went beyond those key objectives. I thought the growth monitoring program was to monitor economic development, what we were trying to achieve in those different areas, and then later on, when you add the other components, what we're trying to achieve there. But it doesn't specifically state that. It only states it's only related to these 7 bullets. And I got a little confused there that it didn't relate back to the overall comprehensive plan, which will have more than just economic development, transportation, admin. It'll have the other components.
Right, but it's monitoring growth data, not necessarily the comprehensive plan.
Well, it should be monitoring what the objectives are in the comprehensive plan, to me, not just these key objectives that growth trends. And when it talks about growth trends, it doesn't specifically relate to what are we achieving in economic development. I thought it would be monitoring those things.
Yeah.
How are we doing? Are we getting those lands filled? Why not?
Right.
You know, I thought it would be doing that rather than just these key objectives here. And that's confused me when I read
Okay.
that. Sorry. I didn't say
There definitely is a lot more included in the growth monitoring program, and I think one thing we could do is just give you all a hard copy as a reference to put in here, so you can kind of see how it complements the policies. Would that be useful and doable, Heather? Yeah. Yeah. And that would help, I think, clarify what's proposed to be in policy, what's proposed to live in the program document, which is a lot more detailed and covers a lot more data.
Okay, well, I was just saying in 1012, the last line, when it says an achievement of key program objectives, it would have seemed to me, it would have said and key comprehensive plan objectives. That's where I'm confused. And that seems to be, as Emily was saying, this higher up thing, because it's not going to be in the action plan, it should be in here. This is a comment.
Okay, thanks. All right, any more on the comprehensive plan? Okay, then Sarah's going to come up, and we're going to go quite a bit forward in your binder to findings and pick up where we left off with the expansion studies.
So just as a refresher, because I know it's been 2 weeks and there's lots of detail in front of you, we are specifically looking at the tabs that are labeled I Findings Appendix A, B, C, and D. These are 4 studies that all interact with each other to look at the specific location of the expansion areas for each type of land and what specific criteria were looked at, and actually walks through all of that analysis. So we talked last session that I was here 2 weeks ago about the way that the 4 feed into each other chronologically. So we start with the school expansion findings, use all of that criteria, narrow in on a recommended location. That gets set aside. We do the same thing for industrial land, and as we go, each one of those is set aside and is not reevaluated in future sections. So that's just sort of a high-level review of what we talked about last time. In the school expansion specifically, we had gotten a little bit into it, so we talked about the introductory language that sort of frames what is the specific need, where is our information coming from, determination of need for a new school site, which looks at those criteria and how the school districts had done their own analysis and how we used that land. Section 3, which talks about the specific characteristics, what type of land do we need, and then getting into Section 4, which looks at the possibility of finding that type of land within the current urban growth boundary before we look outside the urban growth boundary. So all of that is sort of what we had covered last time. And then we get into the actual analysis, which on page 10 of the school findings starts by narrowing down to the specific study area by overlapping the school district with our overall expansion study area to say what land is possible to meet this need before we apply the specific criteria. One of the last things that we had talked about last week, 2 weeks ago, was how we land on the different priority areas, which define the order in which we have to look at land. So the map on page 12 and 13, 12 shows the designations for all of the land within the study area. And then all of that land gets translated based on its designation into either priority 2, priority 3, which does exist in our bigger area but not for schools, or priority 4, which is farm and forest land. And then the evaluation follows those exact priorities. So we look at all the priority 2 land first, and then we look at priority 4, because those are the 2 that we have. So that is where we had gotten up to. The last map in that series is very similar to the map on page 12, except that it shows contextual land use designations, because for the school process, and again, we'll see this in parks, adjacency to other land uses is something that's actually considered. So that's sort of high-level overview, and I want to take a pause and see if there were any questions up to where we are before we dig into sort of the process of the maps.
I have a question.
Yes.
Because I attended the North Eugene High School public meeting. I just am curious, and I think you've already stated this, but just to say it again, how is staff going to present this at the hearing? It's very complicated, and just watching and listening how people actually absorbed or did not absorb, or where the questions came from in terms of presentation. So I'm just curious how this is going to be presented at the beginning of the hearing.
Well, we're still working on that. I think, as you mentioned, the community information session, we're done with those now, and we've heard a variety of things from around the city. The Envision Eugene team is kind of going through what we've heard to figure out the best way to present that information at the joint work session and hearing. So that's very much in process. I'd welcome your advice on that. It is complicated, but it's also foundational to the proposal, and I think important for people to understand. So that's why we included it in the information session's presentation, was to really give that sense of understanding, which I feel like helped in all of the sessions that I was at. So yeah, I welcome your suggestions. We also, as you know, have a companion to all of this technical information in the form of a community guide, which simplifies and kind of puts in context the values pieces and kind of reasons why the city is taking these actions or proposing to take these actions. So there's a variety of different kind of media that we're trying to use to help people understand different parts of the package.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, because that's, it's
Big
not
one.
going to be, it's a big one at the hearing to figure out
Yeah.
how to present it, yeah, effectively. Commissioner Randall?
And I guess just tagging onto that, I was at the presentation at Willamette High School, the last one, and I thought the way the presentation went as far as distilling years of work into 15, 20 minutes, I thought that was very well
was
done,
good.
very clear, very informative without being dry. I mean, it was, I thought, just a real good format to use. It hit a good balance, I think, of information and keeping people's interest. So I think, just to throw that out, I thought that was, and I wasn't at any of the others. I'm assuming it was probably the same presentation.
Well,
Pretty much.
it was, although we improved it, I would say, as we went along. We improved it based on feedback that we got. But the format at those sessions was open house, ask questions, look at materials, look at big maps, then hear a presentation, and then ask follow-up questions after the presentation. So we could do something similar to
Yeah.
that. I haven't thought through the details, but there may be value to having a way for people to get their questions answered before the hearing.
Yeah. Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I was just, when I read this section, I think it's still confusing to a layperson to understand it. And I think it would be helpful if you had the Lane County, I mean, what you're really saying is the Lane County, existing Lane County designation for the, the areas outside of the Eugene city limits are what's determining. And if you just showed that map, because it might have all kinds of other inconsistencies, they would at least understand better how this, this got established the way it is, that it's really from Lane County.
So it's actually a combination of
Right.
Lane County and Metro Plan designations.
Right,
Right
but-
now, they're merged together.
Right, but what I'm saying is if you had the Lane County and Metro, Lane County designation there, it would be made clear.
Which map, Steve?
Well,
On page 14?
yeah, it's like 15 and 14 and 15, you know, because it's only priority 2, it's like 15 and whatever. One shows priority land, so I guess it's D. You know, if you had a Lane County map that showed the designations, so they could see how weird they are. I mean, because that's what's really happening, isn't Lane County's designation is really determining what, you know,
What priority?
what priority, and you're
Yes.
not doing that. So it would explain to them that you're not doing it. It's already been passed by Lane County, and just
No, the majority of this is actually Lane County, and then there's little bits of Metro Plan. But because
Clarify
it
the
does
labeling,
cover
perhaps.
both,
Yeah.
they got
Okay.
consolidated.
Yeah, I will say, originally, staff had prepared it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it confusing because we have an agricultural designation, and so does Lane County.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, just make agriculture and make it one color. So it could be presented either way. It is a difficult one to kind of deal with, maybe 2 maps, but this is the kind of stuff that we're not supposed to be talking about today. But I think we understand, we kind of went back and forth in that too.
Okay. Commissioner Jaworski?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I not talk about it today, but I agree with Commissioner Randall. I thought the information sessions were really well. I think the public hearing might like to follow a similar format, because most of the people that probably went to the informational sections, I'm sure some of them are going to come to the public hearing more than just someone fresh. And it's always good to go in and see something you saw at the informational session and refamiliarize yourself with a map, and maybe have someone standing next to you who didn't attend the informational thing. They can explain it because they were there. I think that's very productive in moving it forward. That's-
Thank you. Commissioner Nicolello?
Hey Terry, did you send out a copy of the neighborhood guide to the planning commissioners?
I can't recall if we did that or not.
It may be helpful to send one out to all of us so we could take a look and see, because I believe it also does include the presentation slides.
It does,
From
that
the
it does.
informational sessions, and may help kind of answer some of the questions that we have here in terms of how things are being presented to the public so far.
Sure.
And then I would take that a step forward and maybe also recommend sending it out to some of the other boards and commissions. Just because it is a really, really great guide, and it does a really excellent job of going over Envision Eugene. And if anyone has feedback, I'm sure Terry would be open to hearing it.
Yep. It's been distributed in a number of different ways. The community information sessions were a really great place to get it in the hands of certain neighborhood leaders or planning commissioners or other commissioners who were at those meetings. But of course, we didn't reach everyone. So we've offered it at the NLC meeting. We've sent an individual email to various groups, but I like your train of thought, because we definitely have more available to get in people's hands.
It is a really, really excellent guide. Staff did a really good job on it.
Thanks.
Commissioner Borowski?
Just a question. Are you guys planning on doing a presentation to the Lane County Planning Commissioners before the public hearing?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
And I just want to put my vote in. I actually really appreciated the format, and I agree with Commissioner Jaworski and Randall that I think it would be, if we can
Helpful.
have time
Yes.
beforehand, have staff there to answer questions,
Yeah.
it might help facilitate a smoother hearing.
That's great feedback.
Yeah.
We have an hour before the hearing that we've advertised, so
Great.
I think that's a good amount of time to lay out a process that makes sense.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you for,
Okay.
okay.
All right.
So then to dive into the details a little bit more, what I'm going to try to do is go through one set of maps, and they tend to repeat. So hopefully just setting that pattern will help as you're going through the document to be able to track that process. So for every section, we look at the study area. Again, I'm on page 15, and we basically gray out everything that you're not looking at, everything that is excluded from this particular moment of analysis. So in this case, on page 15, we narrow down to what is the priority 2 land within our study area. And then, accompanied by text looking at the different site characteristics, we first begin by dismissing land that doesn't meet what we call location-based site characteristics. So in this case, any land that is adjacent to incompatible uses, it is not adjacent to urban residential uses, it is too close to an existing school for equitable distribution, or it is outside of another larger equity-based area of south of Barger and east of Terry Street. So we look at all of those sort of big picture locational areas, and each one of those is color-coded. And in this case, all of the second priority land falls out as not meeting one or more of those characteristics. So for second priority land, we actually don't get into the next set of maps because all of the land has been dismissed under the first set of criteria. And so we pretty quickly then, on page 18, look at, since there's no third priority land in this study area, we're then looking at fourth priority land. Fourth priority land, we apply the same set of characteristics, and that is on page 20. So you'll see a similar map with the same basic colors that are excluding different areas that don't meet the specific criteria, but we do have land that does meet the criteria that maintains that sort of peachy color. And so the next map zooms in on that area to do the next round of criteria, which we call other site characteristics. So that looks at size of the area, whether it has constraints that would prevent a school from being built, so the flood hazard area, protected natural areas, and then arterial or collector access. Is it on a strong enough street to function as a school? And then there were a few sites that are unavailable for school ownership, and if the school can't own them, they can't develop them. So that reduces down to what we have labeled as P4.5, is the area that then continues to meet that criteria. And then for the schools, what we find is, and this is all in text, so we're out of the land of maps at this point, but that particular area is more land than is required. And so we go through a process of, okay, what is the minimum that is needed to meet our needs? Yes.
So what would prohibit, where it says sites unavailable for school ownership? What prohibits the school from owning that land?
So the school has gone through efforts over the last several decades of looking for land in an appropriate area. And so they have sought out land in different areas, and what they've been able to purchase is the entire area that is P4.5. The particular area that is unavailable for school ownership on this map is actually an eWeb property.
Okay.
And that's all in the specific details of the text, but good question. And so through all of that, we land on the map on page 25, which again goes back to the full study area, having excluded everything, including land that does meet the criteria but is more than is needed to the minimum needed school expansion site. So this is by far the simplest of the expansion studies, but it does walk through that process and lays a nice foundation. So before we get on to the more complicated employment study, any questions from the school expansion study? Okay, awesome.
Well,
Commissioner.
Oh, yes.
I'll just add, so say someone comes looking at this and decides that the school board didn't, ask them to buy their land.
Okay.
Because it's better situated, it's closer to the residential areas than the site that's big. I mean, we know that the Bethel School District already owns that land, but there might be other land that, we're calling it, you're calling it unavailable, but it may not necessarily be. That's the question, if someone complains.
And that's why, when although the school board does already own this, or the school district does, it was important that we did not, that was not the basis for landing on that property. In fact, they, what you can see in here is they own 73.9 acres. And we didn't feel that we could justify bringing all of their ownership in. The land that's excluded here being owned and by eWeb, we even looked into whether or not eWeb intends to keep using it, or do they have a future use for it, and the answer is yes. So it was very important from a legal standpoint, basically to dismiss the fact that they do happen to own this land. They made a wise choice in the land they purchased. There weren't a lot of options in the area that they needed in order to serve the particular underserved community with a school. But it would have been a little awkward if we ended up in a different spot, admittedly. Fortunately, this process of elimination in some ways actually is based on logic, and here it zoomed in to the site that they've purchased. But again, we haven't enabled them to we're not recommending bringing in all the land that they own, because it appears to be beyond what they need right now. So, is that anything you would add to that?
No, I think that covered that as much as I would, yeah.
Well, I'll just add, I know the educational people they're people I know in the educational community, and they're going to object to a school out at the very edge rather than, closer to housing. It's just inevitable because they think it doesn't make, it's sort of like Salem School District where they put all the schools out at the edge and now everyone has to get bused. And,
Well, remember, this is Bethel.
Right, but, still, there's no housing really to the north of that. It's all, it's got a little touch of housing to the south, but that's it. It's normally, it's at the edge to the community.
Although it's not at the edge of the actual Bethel School District, it's pretty central,
Right,
which is
but there's-
shown early on in terms of rural.
There's no housing going on, in the rest of our expansion. It's all industrial land. So,
Commissioner Borowski.
And just for me, if we had decided, or if we had decided that we weren't going to expand for schools, that wouldn't have prohibited Bethel from building a school there in Lane County, correct?
It would have.
Oh, it would have. Okay.
School facilities are required to be inside the urban growth boundary.
Or 3 miles outside of it.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
They can be 3 miles outside of it.
And is this more than 3 miles outside of it?
No, it's right next to it.
Yeah. So they could have built it.
No, it has to be either included within the urban growth boundary or 3 miles outside the urban growth boundary in a rural
Beyond.
area.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I see. It has to be beyond the, I
Yes.
see. Okay,
You
that's,
can't
be
build it,
just
leapfrog it.
so
outside of
rural
the
schools
urban
have to be
growth
outside of, 3 miles outside of an urban growth
Right.
boundary. Okay, thank you.
Do you know if someone from the Bethel School District will be present?
We can certainly invite them. They've been very involved in this planning process, and this analysis is based on their approved school facilities plan that guides 10 years of development, right, Beth?
Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
So we could certainly ask for them to be there, and if they anticipate questions, I think they'd want to be there.
Yeah, I was gonna, especially at the beginning hour, it might help, because
suggestion.
even I have a question about Commissioner Baker because of the North Eugene it's not all industrial, actually. There are farms, there are children that lives on the farm. I mean, just so there's not misinformation, I know the population might be less, but just to make sure that Bethel can be there to speak on behalf of the district.
Yep, great suggestion.
Okay, any final questions on schools before we move on? Okay. So the next section looks at employment land, and because we're not looking at a specific school district or in future cases at a specific park planning district, there's a lot more land, which is a big part of why this is the thickest of the studies that you're going to be looking at. So again, in this case, I'm just going to go through sort of one set of maps, and then those maps in this case get repeated over and over and over again in different sub areas. So I'm not going to go through everything. I'm just going to sort of set that pattern and see if any questions come up on that process. So similarly, we have the introduction to provide context. In this case, there's a lot more explicit legal language and framework and statutes that have to be followed for employment lands. And so that is covered in section 2, where that really walks through the process in quite a bit of detail that Emily has been very, very thorough about looking through. And so that goes on for several pages. We talk about our criteria in that section and sort of what the source material is, referencing back to the economic opportunities analysis and other sources that we use to sort of supplement that and specify those criteria. So you'll see like a map of the state highway freight system, which we use to help define some of our criteria. And then on page 9, we get into our section 3, which is again that analysis of the actual land following the process. So page 10 shows a much larger study area than we saw for the school study. So this goes the entire area around our current urban growth boundary, obviously excluding city of Springfield. And you'll also notice that because the school study was first, we've got that school land set aside, and that's not going to be reevaluated. And then on page 12, we have a very similar set of maps to what we had in schools, where we look at, again, that mix of land use designations between Blaine County and the Metro Plan. And for consistency's sake, we did merge them, although we can certainly, in deliberations, have a conversation about whether that is effective. But this merges the different land use designations to show those that are very similar together, and then again simplifies those down to the priority areas. And in this case, we do have some priority 3 land down in the South Hills. And then we also have this series of 4 maps starting on page 14 that gives you a study area wide view of our building constraints. Because future maps zoom into small areas and they're looking only at a specific priority at a time, it's sometimes hard to see the bigger context of what constraints are being considered. So the first map on page 14 shows all of the area with slope that is greater than 5%. And so that is the vast majority of the southern portion of our study area. And this map shows that just more clearly than a lot of the other maps that we have. The map on page 15 shows the special flood hazard area, or the floodplain, which is largely around the confluence of the 2 rivers and in the West Amazon wetlands area. So that gets highlighted a little bit more clearly. And then we look at areas that are under Lane County Goal 5 protection. And so those are just sort of scattered throughout. There's a little bit less of a clear concentration there, but it again just gives you that big picture view. And then the last map is areas that are constrained by uses or development, making redevelopment highly unlikely in the planning period. And that's a big, complicated statement that is delved into more detail in the actual text. It includes some large parcels like the airport, which is very clearly devoted to a use that we don't think in 20 years is going to change. Lane Community College, some of our larger parks, you'll see Spencer's Butte is marked there. So things like that get sort of taken out of the analysis. So that is sort of the context laying before we again strip out everything other than priority 2 and start there. So before I get into the details of priority 2 with that context piece, did any questions come up? Okay, awesome.
Right.
Yes.
We're on page 15 where it says special flood hazard areas
Yes.
that are crosshatched.
Yes.
My map doesn't show anything crosshatched.
It's very small, so it's that blue. It's
So it's just a pale, okay. Good enough. then.
yeah. The printing scale definitely shifts between the legend and how it shows up. That's a really good point. So then on page 18, you'll see a map again of the entire study area with everything grayed out except for that priority 2 land. And because in order to put it on a page, it has to be such a small scale that you really can't see detail, we've just broken that out into 11 sub areas. Each one of those has a name, so P2, priority 2, sub area 1, P21, P22, all the way around. And then each one of those becomes basically a little chapter within the study to look in detail at that land. We're not evaluating these areas as areas. We're not saying it's mostly sloped, and so we're discarding it. We actually look at every single scrap of land within each one of those. This is just a way to get a closer view in a sort of more coherent way. So that is how the map on page 18 translates to the map on page 19. So page 19 is that little box of P2.1 expanded out so you can see this is the area that we're looking at, with no more detail other than here is a new smaller sub area for you to focus on, just to sort of provide that transition. And then on page 20, we apply, again, development constraints. So this looks at what of that second priority land in that area has slope that's greater than 5%, what of it is protected by Goal 5 protections, what has uses or development constraints, and what is in the floodplain, which in this case is nothing. And so there is some land that does not fall under any of those constraints. And so on page 21, everything that is constrained, so we show the specific type of constraint on 20, but on 21 we just say, okay, everything that's constrained is gray. We're just lumping that into one category so we can focus on the next set of criteria. And so on the map on page 21, you'll see most of it is grayed out, some of it is purple, and some of it is black. The portion that is black, which is on the far left side of the map, is more than a mile from access to, in this case, I-5, but a freight corridor. And so that gets dismissed. And we're actually showing what that mile looks like in the yellow. So the portion of the right-of-way that's yellow is within a mile in terms of access. And that's one of the sort of trickier concepts that we played with, how to actually visually show that. So for I-5 in particular, we're looking at access from an on-ramp or an off-ramp. So you might be right next to I-5, but if you can't get onto it, that's not useful for a business if they don't have at least a mile access to get to the highway. So that's just an explanation of what the yellow is representing. Yes. I don't know which one.
It was Commissioner Borowski.
So 30th Avenue isn't a freight route?
No, it is not. It's not in that state designated freight route. The state designated freight routes that we used are Highway I-5, Beltline, Highway 99 outside of Beltline, and Highway 126 outside of Beltline, and 105. So it's a specific map that's approved by the Oregon State Department. That is, what page is that one on? Page 7. So that is where that specific designation of what is a freight route for the purposes of businesses.
Commissioner Baker and then Commissioner Mills.
Yeah, I just was, I was clarifying, I assumed that was from state law, the requirement. And is it 1 mile from a off-ramp or from the route itself?
From an off-ramp or an on-ramp. So in this case, it's only one of them.
Okay.
It's one of those odd places in I-5 where it's not both, but it is access to the highway, and so we used that point.
Commissioner Mills.
Just confirming that the 1 mile requirement is part of state law?
No, that is based out of the economic opportunities analysis and local expertise. And so that has been developed locally in terms of what types of criteria the specific businesses that are being sought.
So how is it codified? I'm just trying to understand how we settle on 1 mile, what kind of flexibility there might be around that, where an opportunity might exist.
So,
Yeah.
want me to get down? And we might want Beth to come up for this. But the what the state law says, and they're pretty uptight about it, is that you can identify particular suitability criteria for the particular use that you've identified as needed for your jurisdiction. So staff spent a lot of time with Chamber of Commerce, for example, talking to them about, what opportunities have we missed? Why are certain firms what we're looking for? Why aren't they coming here? What are the factors we don't have in the land we have available? What do they need? We're required by state law to look at trends in what actually is working elsewhere, what's working here, what's not working here. There's a significant amount of study of it in the EOA, which is part of your employment land supply study. And so it's a local determination. And, there have been some jurisdictions who are clearly dead set to get a particular amount of land, or particular pieces of land where they have been found by the courts to have constructed different criteria to get them to a particular result. And so we have to demonstrate that there's a basis for determining that these are attributes that are needed for the particular industries for their operations. And because of the target industries that have been chosen locally through the, the prosperity plan, regional prosperity plan, and different studies that have been done at the council and regional level, a few suitability criteria emerge. Within a mile of access to a freight route is one of those. Beth, what can you add more to that, or how that works?
Well, certainly, if you think about how this is connected to your target industries, when we're talking about something like manufacturing, if you're manufacturing something, it's an export industry. It has to have a way to get out of the Eugene-Springfield area. Depending on what it is you're manufacturing, you probably need to take it out by truck, unless you're taking it out by rail, but here we're looking at truck. And so you can't be so far from a freight access route that you have to, say, go through neighborhoods. You certainly don't want to do that with big trucks. And when you look at what businesses consider when they're looking at locating in an area, freight access is certainly one of the things that they consider pretty strongly when they're considering locating in, say, Eugene or Springfield or Salem or Woodburn. So they know they want to locate somewhere in the Willamette Valley. So this is why we've looked at that particular site suitability criteria. It's all about getting the trucks in and out in a way that's economically feasible.
Commissioner.
One of the reasons I think that county sees Goshen as such a good, it's one of the things that the county, I think, has looked at in terms of justifying Goshen as an industrial site. It's right there.
Commissioner Borofsky.
Commissioner Mills brought up a good point, and I was just wondering how many parcels do you think, and this is just a ballpark, how many parcels do you think that got dismissed because of the distance from a freight route as opposed to other criteria?
The reason why I'm hesitating on that is because that was the first set of criteria. So a lot of things that we point out here as saying dismissed for distance from a freight route also would have been dismissed because they're too small after the constraints are taken into account. So even having been the primary author of this, I don't have an off the cuff which ones were excluded just for that reason.
Right.
I would say most of the ones that were excluded for that reason were also excluded because they were too small at the end of the day.
Commissioner Mills and then Commissioner Nicolello.
This is a comment. I feel like there's a degree of arbitrariness in your criteria, and I also would offer that. And I'm not disagreeing that this site may be unsuitable. I'm more worried about the fundamentals that you applied to do the test with. In this case, you're saying it's not close enough to a main route, even though you're targeting a 4-lane divided road or 4-lane road with a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, and you're 500 yards short. And I'm thinking that if this were applied in another part of town, it could be through city streets at 35 miles an hour that are already traffic constrained. So in this case, I'm not troubled by you excluding this. I'm more troubled by how the criteria may be applied. And I haven't gone through each and every one of these tests, but it feels a little bit arbitrary. And I'll use that word. I haven't got a better word right now, but I'll think of one. Thank you.
Commissioner Nicolello.
So something that may be helpful is to know what kind of process went into developing this and just reminding the public and reminding the commission of that process. So looking at your local criteria that you work to develop, which is exciting that we're able to have that degree of specificity through the state. You know, who you worked with to help develop that. And I'm not saying that should be a part of this, but just as a separate thing. And then also too, that would even be helpful for the Clear Lake overlay zone, just thinking a little bit ahead, to also show the degree of people and the triple bottom line that was taken as an approach to that as well. Because if that, you know, for example, if that's local criteria that was based on feedback from, you know, groups who are involved in the industrial, I almost said industrial industry, in the industrial world, that would be helpful, I think, to know. We want to make sure that we show that this process has been very, very layered, very stringent, and it isn't just something that was generated in a vacuum, that it was pulled in from other folks.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I have similar concerns to Commissioner Mills, because my first question when I was asking whether the 1 mile was codified by the state, and apparently it isn't. And then when I had looked at the routes that were considered to be legitimate, I mean, within 1 mile of a state designated freight route, and I didn't see the connector to 30th, which is 4-lane and 55, and then yet I see Highway 126 west of Randy Pape, which is a 2-lane road. You know, it's sort of, you're stretching the criteria, it seems to me, a little bit, if that's the way it's applied. And it could very well be, as you suggest, that if you applied the criteria to all of the sites, and you could drop it out on many other reasons, but by doing it in a certain order, then you expose yourself to some questions. If someone complains about that requirement, I mean, 1 mile seems fairly arbitrary. If you go to Portland area, and we looked at these designations, there are lots of, there's a lot of industry that's much farther than a mile from designated state freight corridors, and it seems to function reasonably well. So, you know, and you could go to places in the state where there are no, by this criteria, there would be no state designated freight routes to coast, right? Yet,
Could I
Yeah,
provide a little bit
of course.
Well, and to move us along, because I want to make sure we have enough time to get through the residential stuff. But just in response to this, I want to point out that the city needs to look at comparative factors, you know, so we're trying to find the best land to expand onto. And in trying to come up with the reasonable ways to distinguish between one site over another, this is one that emerged through conversations dating back to the Economic Development Subcommittee of the Community Resource Group, to answer part of your question. But it definitely is an art and a science. There's no magic to the 1 mile. It's just something that's been discussed amongst representatives of the industries and the technical groups that were looking and trying to assist the city with coming up with a method to compare different properties. The last thing I'll say about this is that the text that accompanies the maps does point out where more than one criterion is met. And so if that little blob of black on the map on page 21 actually is made up of small sites, that's pointed out in the text as it goes along. I have read this entire study, and it holds together in my judgment, but you know, that's up to the powers that be to determine in the end. But it is something that's gone into in quite a lot of detail.
So I just want to, before we transition, want to reiterate with what Commissioner Nicolello has said is, I think using this as an opportunity to understand if Planning Commission has these types of questions, where these questions might arise at the hearing, and to just make sure that there is more of that higher level explanation of how the criteria were established. I think could be helpful. No, Commissioner Nicolello.
Just as one more thing, so you mentioned at the beginning that you really wanted to just be high level today and kind of just go over broadly everything. For our comments and things like that, would it be easier for you to meet with us separately? I think it's such a tight timeline before we get to the 7th. Surprisingly, February is already halfway through, which is nuts. So is that how you would like to best address that, or would we have a work session scheduled? I think it's just there's that fear of, will we have time to actually address these in a way that really gets to some of the comprehensiveness of our comments?
Right?
So I wanted, and then I'll have Terry respond. So Terry's outreached to all of you and given you an option, which I would highly recommend that you take advantage of. It's to do just that, is to meet with you each individually to go over the document. So if Terry, you want to kind of reopen your invitation?
Yeah, that's a standing invitation. I think it's always a fine balance to know what to cover within the setting of the meeting and what to hold for follow-up questions, but I think it's going fairly well to this point, and we'd be happy to meet with folks to go over things that are at a more detailed level between now and the hearing. We've got about 3 weeks to do that.
Okay. So definitely contact Terry. I think it's helpful. Commissioner Borowski and Commissioner Baker.
I appreciate that approach, but I also appreciate the approach of doing it as a commission, because I hear things that I may not see in here that raise questions. When Commissioner Mills brings this up about 1 mile, where did it come from? I wouldn't have had that question to ask Terry. And so, to me, I don't, that's one way to address specific questions that we have, but that may not, in my thing, the community or the commission style, okay, these are our questions. I've got questions that I want to ask, but I know that we've got to get through this, but yet I think an open circle discussion might also be advantageous for me.
So so essentially that's what we're doing. So we're having these. So what I'm hearing is maybe an additional meeting might be desired.
Yeah.
Work session might be desired.
Especially if we don't finish today, we
Yeah.
will definitely want to do that.
Exactly.
I want to shortcut your conversation.
Yeah. So sorry I interrupted. So that's what staff, I think, has outlined this to try, considering the timeline, to try to make it as effective as possible. So we are having these sessions. So there's a couple, so definitely reach out individually. It sounds like maybe we want to assess at the end of today if we want one more work session and how and where we're going to fit that in. And the other option, just to remember, what Commissioner Borowski's bringing up also is going to happen during deliberations. So the objective here is not to deliberate. The objective really is to learn about the documents themselves. So it doesn't mean that isn't, so just remember that. We're going to have a full hearing, deliberations, et cetera, where if somebody brings something up that hadn't been brought up prior, we'll have an opportunity to dive into it then. So Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah.
Sorry, Commissioner Baker.
We're raising some things as we go along now, which we're not changing this document. Hopefully, we're taking our own notes or someone is taking those, because some of them I think are fairly relevant to the document. Is it during deliberations then that after the public hearing is had, if there's to be some changes to this, that's where it would occur?
Yeah,
So we
not
can
now.
change it then, and all we're doing now is sometimes noting it. Good.
Yeah,
Right.
we're learning.
I wanted to, just wanted
Yeah.
to be clear on that.
Yeah.
And I take it that, and it seemed pretty clear when she gave her presentation, that the 1 mile issue is pretty much infrastructure driven. And I know in parks, they drew circles and they said a community center is 2 miles, but from edge of the circle, it's sometimes 2 3/4 miles to get there. Is that something that's written in code, how you do that? Or, the state says it will be an infrastructure 1 mile, or,
No, and I will answer you very quickly because I'm out of school right now. This is exactly the kind of thing we're not supposed to be doing now. So
Okay.
I'll just give you a quick answer. No, that's a completely locally derived criterion.
Okay.
The state says you identify the kind of industries that you want. What does your community need? And you study them and you figure out what do they need in order to come to your community out of a site. And the conclusion reached in Eugene's studies is that they need a site that has access to a freight route within 1 mile. So,
Okay, but it could have been 1.5 miles, could have been 1.25 miles.
right, but what we were told, but, is that and it's gonna, and we have to have the same criterion for the entire study area. Once we pick it, it's gotta be the one we use everywhere, so, yep.
So I have two more commissioners, Commissioner Baker and Commissioner Mills.
Yeah, I was, just quick follow-up to Commissioner Borowski. I also feel comfortable with the meeting as a community to discuss it, as a commission, but I also was going to suggest as a fallback or as an addition, when you do have these individual meetings, that you send out the notes of the important issues that were raised to the other commissioners, so we're exposed to it. It's sort of at least it's an attempt to
Sure.
communicate that.
Sure, we did, on that note.
That's all I'm just saying is a
Okay.
possibility.
Yeah, well, we have been taking notes. Your conversations have been very helpful, and our notes from the briefings are also helping us continually improve our communication about these issues. The team is also working on a series of communications that will answer the questions we've been hearing. So we've been at these 6 community information sessions. We've been in briefings with you. We've been in these meetings, and we've started to hear some of the same questions. And so we're dealing with that and coming up with information to get back out via our email newsletter list and FAQs and different things, just to help provide the best communication we can. I wanted to let you know we're doing that.
Sorry, I wanted to finish, though, which
Sure.
is another area. I mentioned actually 3 years. One of the concerns is that there are some members in the community that may object to expanding the urban growth boundary for industrial land. And so any opportunity that's provided that facilitates that, I think you have to be concerned with. The third thing is another technical question is, what about, none of these industries might require rail access? Because you don't talk at all about rail access in here right now. And so, again, I'm not saying, but you're giving groups an opportunity to complain about an expansion because you're not meeting some criteria that they could raise that might be legitimate. So it's good to be aware of that. And also that, we're not targeting any industries at all that might not want this for some reason.
Commissioner Mills.
Two very quick things. I prefaced by the fact that I really appreciate the Herculean effort involved for staff to prepare this document, and the fact that we're asking these questions doesn't make it simpler. But I have to support what Co-Chair Borowski suggested as a concern, in that I think 7 heads are better than 1. And where we do go to individual sessions, I think it's going to be important that any questions that are brought forward in those individual sessions somehow make their way back to the group. Thank you.
Okay, we're at 12:45.
Okay, we are going to try to zip through this.
Yeah.
Okay, so with this map on page 21, what you'll see is, so the second layer of criteria is applied, and there is a box in the legend that says second priority land for further consideration, parentheses none. So in this case, again, through the first wave, there was still some land to be considered. Second wave, everything gets cut out of this particular sub-area. And we follow that exact same pattern through 11 sub-areas of second priority land. And for some of them, actually for none of them in the industrial land does it all get kicked out under the first wave, so you'll actually see that double set of maps for every single area. And in the end, we end up moving on to third priority land, which is on page
55.
Thank you. Page 55, and because that is such a small amount of land, we consider that under a single sub-area. We're able to zoom into a sufficient amount of detail to be able to look at all of that. And again, we apply the first round of criteria. There is some land left over. Second set of criteria, it all falls out. And then we're into fourth priority land on page 60. They're somewhat larger sub-areas just because it's less disparate. And so we end up with 10 sub-areas. look at all of those. We tried to, where they were adjacent to each other, find some form of distinction, whether that's a river or a road. So there is some clear divider between all of these areas, even when they aren't right next to each other. Follow the exact same pattern, but here we start to see more land that meets all of the criteria. So every time we come across a property that has both enough land that's not constrained and meets the criteria as laid out in this in terms of access to a freight route and size, it gets a label. So on page 63, you'll see the first property, or the first site, as we call them, that gets a label, which is P4.1A, and then that gets tagged for further evaluation. And so anytime there's one of those, you'll see additional text beyond that before we get to the next sub area, which goes through an initial analysis before moving on. And that runs through, I'm going to speed through this just in the interest of time. So that gets applied again all the way around the criteria. And then on page 122, you get a map that shows all of the properties that met our full first round of analysis. And so there's a few properties over off of Green Hill Road. There's a large chunk of properties, even more than what the expansion area actually is, in the Clear Lake area. And then there is a few just north of Aubrey. Everything else fell out for a variety of different reasons, which are all in the text, and we're happy to answer questions, but I do want to make sure we get to residential if possible. Once we get to this point, we shift over and start looking at soil for the first time. Everything up until this point has been just looking at, does it meet our baseline criteria? Once we have more land than we need that meets our criteria, we can start saying, okay, is it possible to avoid high-value farmland? So the map on page 124 shows all of those parcels that were noted on the map previous, and it shows high-value farmland and non-high-value farmland in this area. So everything that is green is high-value farmland. Everything that's yellow is not. It is the blessing and the challenge of living in the southern Willamette Valley that we have a lot of great soil. And so what we find through this analysis, and there is an appendix that numerically goes through in more detail, but what we find is that every single site that meets our baseline criteria is high-value farmland. And Commissioner Rose.
Just a question on that, because that was one of the things that was brought up in several of the community things that we're expanding onto high-value soil. Who did the analysis of the soil? When was that done? Was it kind of done like Lane County said, this is farmland, this is forest land back in the 80s? Can you expand a little bit on that?
It is Lane County has, and I'm not going to be able to pull out the specific. Oh, there we go.
Refer back to the appendix at the end. That you looked at this appendix in the back.
Possibly.
So it's the last.
And it's just before the end
7
of
pages.
this exhibit.
So it goes page 142 and then page 1 of the appendix A.
Okay.
So it's the last 7 pages of this tab.
Okay.
And it looks at every property, the specific type of soil, which also includes factors like drainage, and how it's been farmed and what it's being used for, how much of the specific tax lot is each type of soil, what its agricultural class is, which is a national designation, and then high-value farmland, which is an Oregon designation that's precisely done by.
My question was, did we do this analysis?
No.
That's what I was asking, because people, where did that analysis, where did this green map come from?
Well, we created it using information and analysis done by the Lane County Soils Rating for Forestry and Agriculture. So that notation and reference is on page 125 to the documentation and where our source analysis comes from.
Because that,
And that comes from the National Soil Conservation Service usually.
Okay.
So we're not involved in that at all.
right.
But it's the state, isn't it, that determines what is a high-value
Yes.
soil in Oregon?
Yeah, the state has determined that the national classifications don't always match what is high value here. And so sometimes you'll see class 3 and 4 soil that is still valued as high value farmland because of the way it is used in Lane County and because of the purpose that it serves in our agricultural economy. Thank you for that clarification.
And is that forest and farmland, or is that
They're
farmland?
separate.
Okay, so these are all
This is
farm-
all farmland.
Okay,
We were not, none of the land that met our baseline criteria was forest land.
okay.
So we were able to cut out that one piece of analysis and just focus on the agriculture.
Thank you.
Okay. So once we establish the fact that we cannot avoid high-value farmland, our next step is to try to have the most efficient expansion possible to minimize the impact. And so that is what the last section looks at, is what are the possible combinations of sites in general categories that we could use to meet our portfolio of needs. So we have those 4 sizes with specific numbers of sites that the economic opportunities analysis lays out as the portfolio of industrial sites that we need. So 2 sites of 75 acres or larger, 3 sites between 50 and 75 acres, 2 sites between 20 and 50, and 4 sites between 10 and 20. So if you look at the map on 126, it's the colorful bubble map. It assigns a color circle for each one of those sizes of properties, and looks at where can we find all those different sizes. And what we find is that the largest 2 size categories are only present in the Clear Lake area. So every set of maps after that looks at a more specific combination of, here's one way we could meet our portfolio of need, here's another way, and then compares the EC analysis, so the economic, social, environmental, and energy consequences of each one of those types, depending on how spread out it is, where specifically it is, what those impacts are. And so all of that analysis is taken into account, and then they're compared. So there end up being 5 different focused expansion options that are looked at to say, are there different combinations of parcels that we can put together to meet our need with the minimum impact to all of these different considerations. So that is what that section looks like.
Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, when you looked at minimum impact, did you consider on the high-value soils whether or not they were in production or not, or were they all in production?
So we only looked at, in terms of level of detail that we were able to access, it's particularly challenging to look at what type of production, because you can look at, is it a rye field, is it listed and paying taxes but hasn't been for a few years, so just that lag in data proved to be a little bit more detail than we found that we could consistently look at across all of the parcels. Did that make sense?
Yeah, I was just,
Okay.
I don't know that area that well, and I was just wondering if any of it was in really good production that you were taking away from someone versus minimal, like you stated.
Sure.
Commissioner Nicola.
I think another thing that might be helpful too is when we talk about this, to also talk about the Clear Lake overlay expansion, because there has been some concerns about folks using, about the loss of agricultural land. I believe that agricultural use is also a designated list, is also a designation listed in the overlay zone.
It's an allowed use.
An allowed
Correct.
use, I apologize, not
Yeah.
designation. But also an allowed use, so to help maybe alleviate some of those concerns, that might be an excellent thing to bring up in the earlier
Sure.
hour-long session before the public hearing.
Oh, sorry.
Commissioner Borowski.
When you did these circles, the red circles for the large lots, had you factored in the overlay zone into that when you did that or not?
No.
Okay. And
The
when-
overlay zone sort of chronologically comes after the determination of the
So
fields.
when we do it, put the overlay zone in, do any of those constraints limit the red circles? I mean,
There's a whole study about that. That was good. Yeah.
They align, they're intended to align.
Yeah.
thank you.
So to answer that question in a little bit
Yeah.
more detail, what this entire tab gets us to a general area that says, okay, based on all of our analysis and what the state says we need to consider, this looks like the best place to meet all of those values. But having heard about wetlands, having heard about other constraints, we have Appendix D, which skips over parks, So we do schools, employment, parks, and then there's this addendum to the UGB expansion analysis for employment land. And what that does is it basically bridges the gap between what is the general area that we're landing on and how do we get to the Clear Lake overlay zone. So it's sort of connective tissue that considers additional information that we looked at in this area that we don't have for the entire expansion area. So once we found an area that looked really promising, further analysis was done, and so that has its own study. So that's where the addendum is.
So that kind of segues into something I wanted to make sure we touched on, which is the final tab in here as the goal 5, it says goal 5. In the goal 5 findings, as I mentioned, the city staff chose to do a really in-depth study of where those wetlands are in the expansion area, proposed expansion area, and which ones we would protect locally. In order to make sure that there's enough land that in that red circle, for example, to accommodate the industry and the size that we've kind of pegged it for. So the studies that show where that land is and what's going to be protected are behind that final tab, which is I. And those come in to this addendum. Those are what they are kind of overlaid into this analysis before a determination is made on whether or not this area is enough and the right land to meet our needs in terms of the different size requirements, and can we get it down to just that which we need in order to meet our needs.
Commissioner Borowski.
So, and I got that. I got that you looked at the map, you did the circles, you said, here's wetlands. I could still fit 75. Did you do the 1,000-foot buffers also? So if you've got wetlands and the 1,000-foot buffer on restricted industries, was that also in consideration as to the applicability of a 75-acre parcel?
We're going to make a note of that and kind of explain. That's one of those things where,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Commissioner Baker.
I just wanted to clarify, I'm going way back to page 6
Sorry, which document?
of the main section.
Okay.
And we don't have to go there, but it's just, it starts off by talking about being a contiguous area. In other words, you need 4 10 to 20 acre sites. Did you evaluate all these sites to see if there are any 10 or 20 acre sites, or only the total acreage that you needed for the entire? It talks about contiguous, so I'm concerned where someone might be concerned that there were some sites. In other words, you could have zoned some 10 and 20 acre sites over here and done not on high value farmland, for example, and then the 75 acre sites ended up having to be over here.
Short answer is yes. That contiguous area criteria is applied to every single site of any size.
Is that required by state law? Probably not.
No, that's something
Okay.
they chose to do locally, yeah.
Okay, yeah, there's a,
Commissioner Mills, did you have something?
Okay. So trying to wrap things up. So again, we'll have those 5 different options for how to meet the portfolio of need, which is the last substantial section of the employment expansion area. And then on page 140, we look at, once we've landed on an area that meets that expansion area need, there are small parcels that come in just in order to create a cohesive boundary, so we don't have little islands that are outside of the urban growth boundary, which doesn't really work for the way the urban growth boundary works. And so those are all noted on the map on page 141 and are evaluated and taken into consideration. And in the appendix, we also address how we are able to use those to meet our small industrial, smaller than 10 acre industrial need. Just sort of, we have to take them in anyway, and it happens to meet this need. So it was a really nice combination of needs there. So that, and then that flows right into the appendix. So that is the whole beast of the employment I could go through the parks, but it really follows the exact same pattern. Again, it'll lay out a little bit closer to schools, although there's 2 areas because there's 2 specific park areas with need that are identified. But it follows that same pattern of here's a study area, here's our criteria, here's following through, gradually whittling down, and then ultimately distinguishing between potential sites.
Commissioner Nicolello.
I know we need to move into residential, so I'll be super quick. But I think kind of based on some of what I'm hearing and what I've also heard in other meetings as well, is just really helping the public understand what's required by state law, where does the city go on a local level to do local criteria. And then I'm also hearing some folks express comments that are looking for land that, as people say, is shovel ready, and that's not necessarily required by state law. The state doesn't require the city to do shovel-ready land, which brings in, the points about even doing wetland evaluation. It sounds like that's going above and beyond what you're required to do by the state. So helping people understand that so they can make their comments about the criteria as applicable and tuned as possible, I think might be really helpful to ensure that we have really productive deliberations and that the public comment that's provided is also as effective as possible.
So I'm going to follow up, is that I do want to remind the Planning Commission that a lot of the questions we've had in this section, we've already been briefed on these. We actually have already gone through this process, and staff came to us several times. In fact, I'm almost thinking it would be great if staff could send out a reminder. So just remember that. So read the information carefully, because for us to spend a lot of time on something that, anyways, I just want to remind you that we have had this opportunity, Clear Lake overlay as well. For instance, the wetland piece, that additional analysis was actually encouraged by the subcommittee, which Commissioner Mills and I were a part of, because we wanted a determination. So the City of Eugene did go beyond to make sure that we were identifying land that actually was developable, and what would that look like considering the wetlands, for instance. So just be, as we enter this, we can also help facilitate a smoother process by us not confusing it. So I would encourage you to look closely at this document and make sure you put that into context.
Appreciate that. Thanks. You guys have done it. I think we're on to residential, which if we don't finish, we can add a meeting, so no pressure. But we have Beth here. I think we want to dive into the residential land supply study to the extent that we can today. You want to give a little overview of the ordinance?
Yes. So the way that these ordinances are teed up is as we've told you before, Ordinance 1, an action recommendation, will first take place on the employment land and schools and parks package. So that establishes the basis that you assume would be there when we look at the residential piece, which allows the residential piece to cover a lot less. So for an example, public facilities, transportation, those are addressed in the first ordinance. The ordinance for residential land, the only thing that we've identified within the ordinance itself that we're most certainly going to change is in discussions with county staff. County staff felt that it would be, for a number of reasons, better if the county planning commission and board of commissioners also did a recommendation in action on the residential piece, particularly in the changes that you see in the ordinance itself on page 2 to the metro plan itself. And so we're going to go ahead and basically have the Lane County Planning Commission acting in the same role as you. So there is a reference in this draft ordinance in your packet to the type 1 process. We're taking it through the type 2 process. The law is not absolutely clear that they're not needed, and the thought is it will eliminate that issue, at least at the local level of them acting. So the first section of the ordinance does make the metro plan change, the only change to the metro plan that we'll be making for residential land. And it simply says that in 2017, City of Eugene adopted the residential land study as part of our Envision Eugene comp plan. There's a whole bunch of language in the metro plan right now in the findings that relate to the old residential study that covered Eugene and Springfield. And we are stating that those findings no longer apply. We have this new study adopted as part of the Envision Eugene comp plan. The second section of the ordinance amends the Envision Eugene comp plan to do just that. If you look under tab A1, we're adding a paragraph in this through this ordinance to the UGB chapter that attaches to the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan, the residential land supply study. We don't need to do anything more than that with this proposal because the residential land supply study determines that the land within the UGB that's been established by the first ordinance is sufficient land to meet our residential needs. So we don't have to expand, and there's no more that needs to be done other than the adoption of these findings.
Can I ask you a quick question? So in terms of just logistics, so essentially the way the application's being reviewed and accepted is the first ordinance is one, go through it, review it, check it. And because of the way you're addressing this is truly second.
It is truly second.
Yeah, okay. So I think that's another, obviously an important thing that I was hearing some confusion on the neighbor side,
Right.
even though it's fairly obvious. But it seemed, because they're all together, they're seeing it together, just
Right.
not understanding.
And when we talk about the jobs, parks, and school ordinance and the residential ordinance, I tend to actually call it the establishment of the UGB and the jobs and parks and school ordinance, that because we establish and add some land to the UGB through that first one, which is pretty big deal. We do it for jobs, parks, and schools. But that's the first one that says, okay, this is the Eugene urban growth boundary, including a couple of bump outs. So, yeah, this one takes that boundary and says it's enough for residential land.
Yeah. So it's just not concurrent. I mean, that's the main thing, is that people have
Yeah.
been confusing this as a
Right.
concurrent
And-
situation. Even though they're separate, they're concurrent, but they're not. They're separate and
Right.
staggered.
And we, this is something that our office has recommended to city staff from the beginning of the process, because there are very different kinds of concerns in communities that care about the jobs, parks, and schools expansion versus the residential issues. And we expect that one, maybe both, will be appealed to the state. And if we are remanded on one, we would like that the other isn't held hostage in a sense. So we very often will break your products up into 2, 3, sometimes more ordinances. I can't remember, the new land use code was adopted through several ordinances for this reason. So those are kept separate.
Back in 2002, you mean?
Back in 2002, yeah. It was a while ago. Sorry. Section 2, I'm going to let Heather talk about, or sorry, Section 3, I'm going to let Heather talk about if you have any questions. These are the code changes to affect that very last efficiency measure for residential land that the council directed us to include. It changes the minimum density for land in R2 with some exceptions. So because the code amendment here is fairly brief, we included it right in the body of the ordinance itself instead of an exhibit. And then there's findings. So the bulk of this ordinance really is the adoption of the residential land supply study. And how did you want to walk through that?
I was going to let Heather
Heather?
do that.
Oh, Heather's here.
Hi. So Heather and Beth are here. We're doing, just like we did with the employment land study, we're going to walk through the residential land study, but I'm not going to spend as much detail given the time and also because we did this before. It's the same concept as the employment land study. So, and just as a reminder, so this is Appendix A-2, the RLSS. And it's made up of, I think this one's 5 parts because there's no expansion part to it. Whereas the employment land study is 6 parts, and each part has its own page numbering system. So I know that was a little tricky last time, so I just wanted to remind you about that. So starting with, there's an introduction section, but then going straight to part 1. Part 1 is really that 2012 snapshot of our land supply. How much vacant land do we have? How many acres in the residential plan designations? How much, actually we start out with how much of our land is protected and committed, same as employment. Then how much is vacant, and this is on page 7. How many acres are vacant? How many acres are developed? And then on page 9, we get into partially vacant. So that is the, larger lots that have some development on them but have capacity for more housing. So we make some assumptions about that. And what you start to see in, what you start to see here is that we summarize the results at the end on page 12, which is the conclusion about how many vacant and partially vacant acres we have, and it's broken out here, and then those are represented again for the 2012 inventory on these maps. And so just like with the employment, we shouldn't really be going back to these maps because these are just our 2012 snapshot. There's no efficiency measures on here, that sort of thing. So then we quickly get to part 2, which is the housing needs analysis, and this is the companion document to the economic opportunities analysis that's in the employment land supply study. So I'll turn it over to Beth here.
So that I don't confuse you this time like I did last time, anything that I'm talking about, page numbers or tables, are from this page forward. So from the piece that says Part 2, Eugene Housing Needs Analysis. So the purpose of the housing needs analysis, the residential land study, was first of all to understand the housing land base, which Heather has talked about, to look at how demographic and socioeconomic trends are affecting and may affect Eugene's future land needs, future housing needs. To look at housing need based on population growth. So you've got a population forecast that was adopted a number of years ago. So how housing needs are based on population growth, how they may change for those demographic and socioeconomic trends, and then looking at housing affordability and how that's affecting Eugene's housing needs going forward, because we all know that it obviously it is. The housing needs analysis determines Eugene's needed housing density and mix. So we look at what the housing density, so how many dwelling units per acre, lot sizes, those sorts of things, and mix, so single-family detached housing, single-family attached housing, and multifamily housing. So how that housing density and mix may change from what we already have. And then making a determination of, does Eugene have enough land for needed housing? What we did, just starting with the buildable lands inventory, I'll just say that it was detailed, extensive, and was very well vetted. The city of Eugene did more work on identifying partially vacant land and potentially redevelopable land and issues of vacant land than any other city that I've worked with. In the housing needs analysis, we start with a review of Eugene's historical development patterns. So if you go to page, say, 24 and 25 of this document, and looking at tables 4 and 5, you see some information about housing mix, so trends in housing mix. So what we've got currently, how that's changed over time. We're looking at it from a couple of different sources of information, which is why the numbers look a little different in some places. And then looking at housing density, which you see on page 28 and 29. So we did an evaluation of development that occurred in Eugene between 2001 and 2012. We chose that period because that's about when your new land use code went into effect. So we didn't want to look at time before that new land use code because it wouldn't be representative of development going forward in Eugene. And then the next step in the analysis starts on page 31, where we're projecting the number of new units needed over the next 20 years. So we consider a whole bunch of things, like household size, persons in group quarters, that sort of thing. And on page 36, table 10, we come to a forecast of demand for new housing units in Eugene between 2012 and 2013. And that was 15,105 new dwelling units. This determination is really based, as I said, on the population forecast and then the best available data, which is census data about the characteristics of Eugene's housing market. And so then the next pages, a lot of them, from 37 on through page 96, there's a lot of information in here about national trends in housing. So what's the housing market doing if you look at it from a national level? A little bit about state trends, and then a lot about local trends in housing. So looking at the housing market in Eugene and Lane County relative to Oregon. And then also looking at demographic factors that may affect future housing needs. And so on page 96, we've got a couple of these very big tables that go through some of the key changes that we're seeing in demographics, both in Eugene at the state level and also nationally. So things like the aging of the baby boomers and how that will affect housing need. We've called them in this study the echo boomers, but I think people more call them the millennials now more frequently. So how the aging of the millennials or the echo boomers will affect this. And just think, at the end of this planning period, by 2032, the youngest echo boomers are going to be 35 years old, and the oldest ones will be 55 years old. And that's in a lot of ways what we're planning for, is how are demographics going to change over this period. And then we've also got growth in immigrants and ethnic composition, of which the largest ethnic group here in Eugene is Latino population. So what we've done in that table is trying to connect these macro changes to things that are going on in Eugene and Lane County, including income, household composition, and then housing affordability, and then say, how's that going to change things in the future? And how's that going to change things in the future is really discussed through the discussion of needed housing, which starts on page 100 and, well, it ends sort of on page 110. It starts a little bit before that, page 102. And so the conclusion that we come to is that Eugene's needed housing mix is a little different from the past. You need a little bit more multifamily and single-family attached housing. Those provide relatively more affordable housing types over time. And you're going to continue to need housing that's affordable at all income levels. So from very low income levels to high income levels. And then the final part of this is looking at, we translate that into number of dwelling units by plan designation. And then we hop back to the buildable lands inventory, and we look at the estimate of capacity of buildable land. And that's done on page 119 to 147. Again, I would say that's a very detailed analysis and goes through land, looking at it in a lot of different lights. So low density land that's below 900 feet, and that's above 900 feet, because these are governed differently in the code. Medium density land and high density land, and then looking at capacity based on different sizes of parcels. So if you've got a 1 acre parcel or a half acre parcel, for instance, you're not necessarily going to need to build roads on that parcel. But if you have a vacant 10 acre parcel, you will need some land for roads. So all of that has been accounted for, as well as can be accounted for. And then the last piece, we answer the question of, does Eugene have enough land to accommodate housing inside the current UGB, urban growth boundary? And the answer, preliminarily, before we do a whole bunch of other work, is yes for everything except high-density residential. But that yes will pop around a few times to some no's in some cases, as we take a look at land needed for public and semi-public uses and other types of land need, which I'll hand it back to Heather for.
Yeah, I just want to see if there's any questions about that part, because the housing needs analysis is the biggest component of the RLSS.
Can I jump in one more time? Once again, this isn't the first time, obviously, that you've seen this. And I was just thinking, just because of the level of questions from before or earlier in today's meeting, I think it would be helpful to send out a summary of not only what we've seen and the drafts that we've gone through, but also City Council, so that the Commission can be aware that there's been a certain level of evaluation and discussion already, not only by us, but by City Council, so that there's a better understanding of really where our review should be focused on. Thank you. Commissioner Baker?
I was just going to suggest if there's a little time, maybe since we have a representative of the Home Builders at the end, if there's a little time, maybe they could comment, because they're closely interested in residential land on this, just so we know about their concerns.
And there will be time also, as he knows, during the hearing, so.
Okay, I'm going to go on to part 3 then, which, so part 3, page 1 is the next section. And so here's where we're looking at other uses that take up capacity on residential land. So on page 2, you'll see that, for instance, on table 1, low density residential land, we, based on review of city master plans and CIPs, capital improvement plans, the parks project list, we come up with low density residential land. There's about 109 acres that are needed of low density residential land for public uses. It's a much smaller impact on medium density and high density, but the point is that capacity that will get taken up by other uses and not for housing is accounted for in this section. Let's see, and so if you go to the conclusions on page 7, you'll see that while, as Beth mentioned, low density residential originally had a 10-acre surplus, and when you just looked at the 2012 impact and compared it to the 2032 demands for housing, now that we've factored in public demand on low density residential land, as well as some employment uses that happen on residential plan designations, that's mostly like neighborhood commercial, we come up with a deficit of 133 acres of low density residential land. For medium density, we still have a surplus of 109 acres, even when we factor that in. And then for high density residential, again, on the 2012 inventory, we had a deficit of 53, and so that deficit got worse. It went up to 91 acres. So part 4 is where we're detailing the efficiency measures are the actions that we can take to fit more housing inside their urban growth boundary. That's the next part. Most of these we've already acted on. So residential redesignation's the first one listed. That had the biggest impact because we redesignated, you see in the table there, for a result of adding 645 low-density housing units to land that we redesignated. And then you keep going. We're working on adjusting permit fees for secondary dwelling units. That gets us about 84 additional secondary dwelling units. Not a huge bump, but that's there. The R2 medium density residential zoning code amendments, so that starts on page 7. Those are the code amendments that we talked about this summer, and those are the code amendments that are embedded in the residential ordinance. And so that's bumping up the density in R2 zoning from 10 units per acre to 13. You might remember in the summer that it was 14 is what we had out there, and that's because we didn't know where council was going to land on the where the threshold would be for this new density to apply. They landed on, and what we heard from the community was, don't apply this new density to lots that are less than half an acre. But they could have gone anywhere to an acre or more or less, and when they landed on a half acre, this analysis is in here, and that meets our medium density need, even with the half acre exemption. Affordable housing, right now we have one land bank site that's medium density residential. Normally that would be identified in our buildable lands inventory as committed land for public use, so we wouldn't assign any housing capacity. So we add that back in as an efficiency measure because we specifically bought that property to do housing on it. And we sell it to affordable housing providers for a reduced rate, so it is an efficiency measure. And then number 5, again on page 9, high-density residential downtown through development incentives like MUPD, the multiple unit tax exemption program, and existing programs that help facilitate more housing downtown. Again, that's one of the strategies we talked about this summer and did outreach on.
Heather, can I interrupt really quickly? So I just wanted to bring this up as something to address during the hearing. It's happening now. There's proposal at City Council. It's using that as an efficiency measure, yet you have this process of real high concerns of safety. So being able to, as staff, be prepared to talk about both of those things, because as an efficiency measure, if we have safety that's also a challenge and isn't being addressed, I think there's a high level of concern right now in the downtown area, those living in downtown already. And I know that conversation is happening. So just to identify
To recognize
and
it.
where that's going, what the next steps are,
Yep, and we did receive comments about that in the outreach we did this summer, so thanks. And then associated with that is the downtown riverfront special area zone. This is really the EWEB riverfront property. We've already done the zone changes and master planning for that area, and it's part of the MUPD boundary, so we don't need to do anything more there. But again, this is kind of recognizing the actions we've already taken. So the conclusion is on page 14 that we end up with a little bit of a surplus for low-density residential, 47 acres, which is almost 200 dwelling units. A little bit of a deficit, which is negligible, for medium-density residential, 4 acres, and then high-density residential comes out even because, again, we're proposing to put all that deficit of housing downtown. So the last part is part 5, and that is really our maps that show all the changes that happen, like in the Crow Road area where we redesignated land. Those are all reflected on these updated inventory maps. The other thing that Part 5 shows is, as Beth mentioned, we have a pretty complicated and intricate system for determining capacity on our land, the housing capacity on our land, what elevation it is, what size is it. So on page 2 of Part 5, that actually has is reflected there. So in order to figure out what your capacity is, you use the maps for the supply and you use the capacity assumptions, how many units per acre, to figure out what the capacity is. So it's just kind of a cross-check so that it's all in one place for the future. And that is the residential land study.
So we have a couple of minutes, and I want to make sure we leave enough time for us to discuss the next steps to address Commissioner Borowski's question, concern. So are there any questions on residential? Commissioner Jaworski.
Yeah, you talked about echo boomers, and you said there'll be 55 in 2032.
2035.
Okay, I live in an area where I was surprised there's a tremendous amount of 55 and over developments. Would you accommodate for where those people might be downsizing as their kids leave? Or, in other words, single-family housing, but did you look at land that could accommodate maybe that kind of need? And those that are not boomers now, but will be between 55 and, let's say, 65 or so, that want to live in, those are pretty affordable housings that they're in. And does the land accommodate something like that, or is that too specific?
So I think you're asking for, is there, does the study accommodate development of 55 and older communities?
100 units or so, but they're single homes, they're not apartments.
Right, right. And so what we assumed about people over 55, so retirees, and this is based on a number of surveys that have been done about retirees, is that a lot of them want to stay in their house as long as they can. Some are downsizing. Some are downsizing to smaller single-family units. Some are downsizing to multifamily units, especially when they when that's what they can afford. And then people are moving into assisted living of various types as their health fails or they otherwise make that choice. The type of housing that you're talking about, the 55 or older, owner-occupied housing, that's not different in terms of density ranges than other types of housing. So we didn't necessarily need to forecast that separate from other types of single-family detached housing. It's going to look different and it's going to function a little bit differently, but in terms of how the city might regulate it for density and lot sizes, it's not a lot different.
Any other questions? Okay, so I want to just address this question. So really, I think Emily and Terry did a great job of explaining this is really kind of an educational piece. So what I want to make sure that we understand is that's where I inappropriately interrupted, is that deliberations is the time. So there's learning and then there's deliberations where we actually get into the meat of the document. So I want to make sure if we're going to add something, we add it where it's most helpful for us. So, and what does the schedule look like? So I guess I want an understanding, what is the level of discussion that you want? So do you want more education? So that would be pre-hearing on the document. Or would you rather have maybe an extra for deliberations, an extra meeting for deliberations? Or both, but Commissioner Borowski.
I think it could go into deliberations. For me, one of the things that will happen as after the public hearings, I anticipate a fair amount of questions that we're going to have for staff. Right. And so whether that's before, I mean, I have questions already, and I think that the deliberation or the public hearing will bring up more questions that we'll have from staff. So I just want to make sure that there's ample opportunity, one, for staff to either answer those questions on the spot or be able to get back to us with answers that will help inform the deliberations.
Part of it's tricky because we've scheduled the hearing, but we don't know if we'll get through everybody in one night. So we're trying to make contingency plans, but some of that we're just going to have to adjust as we go. Right now, we've held time on your calendar for the hearing. We're looking for a backup date if there's overflow needs, and we've scheduled 3 deliberation meetings. And this, I think, is really up to you guys. I think we may need to add additional deliberation meetings, but I'd like to keep it within the same window of time so that we get through it all in an efficient manner and you're able to provide your recommendation to the council. And so that's the whole month of April right now is blocked for this, and we can add meetings even at other times if we need to and if you'd like to.
So let me get a show of hands of who would like to, so you understand the difference between education and deliberations. The deliberation, we just want to make sure there's a process that the public can be involved in our discussion in a way. So we're kind of, that's why Terry and Emily have been really good about saying, okay, we're moving towards what looks and feels more like deliberations rather than just educating ourselves. So with keeping that in mind, how many, show of hands, wants another, to try to fit in another meeting just for the educational piece before the hearing?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Could we outline what the schedule looks like in April and for deliberation, so we know how many meetings we have?
You have 3 right now on the books for the 10th to
Public.
book March 9th. So we would want to keep that hearing really close to the original hearing.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we weren't going to push it in, and it wasn't going to be
No,
one of our
well, you don't want a lot
deliberations.
of space between the hearing dates.
Okay, Commissioner Nicolello?
I would say the other thing to consider too is what can be taken care of in one-on-one conversations with Emily and Terry so we can be as efficient as possible. If we feel like we need to do another educational session, that's totally fine, but also just thinking too about kind of if that's the most effective usage or if those questions can be handled in a better way.
So, yeah, I just want to get a show of hands, and this is really, Commissioner Mills and Commissioner Borowski had requested this. So how many pre-hearing believe we need another educational session? Okay. So hearing, should we, yes.
I guess I have a concern about individual sessions and information sharing that should come out of those.
So sharing, you had recommended kind of sharing you, and I
Yes.
think Commissioner Baker had said,
Right, I think
make
that-
sure we share it.
I think I'm okay with going ahead with individual sessions for efficiency's sake, but I think that information that comes out of there needs to be shared.
Okay. Staff, is that reasonable, possible to do? Okay.
So
Thank you. And it doesn't create some kind of issue.
Yeah, that's fine. And I mean, it's really important that when staff's offering, you feel free to talk with them. And if you among yourselves have an agreement to info share and staff are willing to do that, there's no legal issue.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Commissioner Mills, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Jaworski?
Yeah, sort of a general question, maybe Emily can answer. This isn't quasi-judicial, but if we hold a public hearing and we go into deliberations, does that mean we're still open to comment from people and people can come and talk and we're in the public session? Or is it like a quasi-judicial where we say no?
What we do, the practice in Eugene is that there is a point when the record closes for the Planning Commission's deliberations. And that's largely to draw a line for so that you can actually kind of sit down and look at everything and make a recommendation. Folks, obviously the record opens back up for the elected officials. And so what staff generally does is if somebody wants to submit something, and at that point it would be in form of an email most likely, or something comes in the mail, those are held and they're added, staff goes ahead and adds all those to the public record for the city council.
Okay.
So there's never a time when if testimony comes in, it just doesn't get seen. But there is a time after which we call it for you guys, and anything new that comes in goes in that part of the record.
Thank you. We're 8 minutes over time, and I know people have obligations, so we'll.
Just have one more
Okay.
thing to say. The chair and I are scheduled to meet this week with the mayor and the president of the council to convey our things. So if there's anything that you guys feel like you would like us to bring up in that meeting? Obviously, we didn't have time to discuss it here, but maybe you could send an email or something like that.
Yeah, and we have notes from the retreat and subsequent meetings. So, okay, I'm going to call the meeting. Commissioner Baker,
Well, the only-
please keep it really short.
No,
This
the only
is-
thing I was, when we were talking about deliberations, I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to schedule another meeting in April tentatively, just so you're covered. And it doesn't make sense to probably do the 3rd, because if we find out on the 10th we're moving quickly, there's no reason to have it. But so maybe we'd have to have 2 meetings one of those weeks, and it would be good to block it out now to make certain that commissioners could attend.
Yep, we'll poll you for that.
Okay, thank you for staying a little later today. Sorry. Okay, this adjourns today's meeting.